It was the beginning of a friendship, and I remember laughter more than anything in the world. Judy's the most tremendous friend. She's been a huge support and hugely loyal.
For more than 60 years, the world watched two women share a stage, a set, and a strange kind of silence about what they actually meant to each other. Judi Dench and Maggie Smith were called friends. They were also called rivals. Reporters loved to hint at tension between them, as if two women who had outlasted nearly everyone in their profession could not possibly just enjoy sparring with each other. When Maggie Smith died in September 2024 at the age of 89, Judi Dench did not deliver a smooth, rehearsed tribute. She sat in front of an audience, tried to explain what grief had taught her, and could not finish the sentence. That unfinished sentence said more than any headline ever could. It confirmed something that had been misunderstood for decades. The rumor was never really about hatred. It was about a bond too complicated for easy description. And now, at 91, Judi Dench has nothing left to hide behind. People who did not know Judi Dench and Maggie Smith personally often assumed their closeness would look like other celebrated friendships. Warm, gentle, full of public affection. That was never their style. Both women came out of British repertory theatre, an environment that rewards precision over sentiment. On stage, an actor does not get a second take. There is no editor to soften an awkward pause or smooth over a flat delivery. You either command the room or you do not. Dench and Smith learned that lesson early, and it shaped the way they related to one another for the rest of their lives. Their friendship ran on wit, not warmth. They teased. They corrected each other's timing. They swapped barbed compliments that sounded, to an outsider, almost like insults. To anyone who understood theatrical culture, that banter was intimacy. Only people who trust each other completely are willing to be that blunt. This is why rumors of rivalry followed them for so long. Two women born within weeks of each other, both trained on the same London stages in the 1950s, both eventually becoming dames of the British Empire, both winning Oscars, both remaining fixtures of British film and television into their 80s. It was almost inevitable that the press would frame their relationship as a contest. Who was funnier? Who aged better? Who got the bigger role? Who was asked first? Smith herself sometimes fed that narrative with a joke, noting once that she and Dench went back a long way, having once shared a dressing room where Dench played the young ingenue, while Smith did not get that treatment. It was a throwaway line, delivered with Smith's trademark dryness, but it hinted at something real. Two extraordinary women measuring themselves against one another for most of a lifetime. It is worth pausing on just how unusual their circumstances were. British theatre in the mid-20th century was not an easy place for young women to build a lasting career. Roles were limited, competition was constant, and the industry was far more forgiving of men who aged on stage than of women expected to remain youthful and decorative. Dench and Smith entered that world within a few years of each other, both determined to be taken seriously as dramatic actors rather than simply decorative presences. They were not natural allies by circumstance. If anything, the structure of the profession they had chosen pushed women like them to view each other as competitors for a small number of serious opportunities. That they became close despite that pressure, rather than because the industry made it easy, says something about the specific kind of respect they held for each other's work. Their early years at the Old Vic also placed them inside a demanding repertory system, where actors were expected to move between wildly different roles across a single season, sometimes performing a tragic lead one week and a minor comic part the next. That environment builds a particular kind of trust between colleagues, because everyone sees everyone else at their best and their most exposed. Dench and Smith watched each other stumble through difficult performances and recover. They watched each other take enormous risks with material that could easily have failed in front of a live audience. That shared exposure, more than any public statement either of them ever made, is likely what cemented a bond neither felt the need to explain to journalists. That measuring, though, was never the enemy of their closeness. If anything, it strengthened it. When you spend decades near someone whose talent forces you to raise your own standard, you either resent them or you become sharper because of them. Dench and Smith chose the second path. They watched each other take risks, fail sometimes, recover, and keep working. They witnessed each other's insecurities up close, the kind that rarely make it into interviews. That is not the foundation of a shallow rivalry. It is the foundation of a friendship built on total recognition. To younger audiences, Maggie Smith is often remembered through two roles: Professor Minerva McGonagall in the Harry Potter films and the Dowager Countess of Grantham in Downton Abbey. Both characters relied on the same weapon, a single perfectly timed line that could dismantle another character in seconds. Smith became famous, in her later years, for turning disapproval into an art form. A raised eyebrow from her could feel more devastating than a shouted insult from anyone else. But reducing Maggie Smith to that late-career persona misses most of her career. She won her first Academy Award for The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie in 1969, playing a schoolteacher whose self-belief curdles into something unsettling. She won her second Oscar for California Suite in 1978, playing an actress unraveling under the pressure of an award ceremony, a role that let her turn Hollywood's own vanity into comedy. In between and beyond those films, she moved through Shakespeare, West End comedies, Merchant Ivory dramas, and Agatha Christie mysteries. She worked with Laurence Olivier at the National Theatre. She built a reputation as one of the most technically precise actors of her generation, someone who could deliver comedy and tragedy in the same scene without the audience noticing the shift. That range is part of why the public image of Smith as simply the sharp old woman always felt incomplete to the people who actually knew her. Judi Dench understood the fuller picture because she had watched it form over decades. She knew the version of Smith who fought for serious dramatic roles before the world reduced her to one-liners. She knew a woman capable of real vulnerability, not just command. Smith's personal life carried more difficulty than her public image ever suggested. Her first marriage, to actor Robert Stevens, was strained by his struggles with drinking and instability, and the marriage eventually ended after years of difficulty, though the two remained connected through their sons, Chris Larkin and Toby Stevens. Smith later married playwright Beverly Cross, and their partnership lasted until his death in 1998. She never remarried. Publicly, she carried herself with the same control she brought to every performance. Privately, she understood loss in a way that rarely made headlines. Judi Dench understood that kind of loss too. Her husband, actor Michael Williams, died in 2001 after a long illness, and Dench has spoken over the years about how grief reshaped her, describing it at times as something that could be converted into energy rather than simply endured. When she broke down discussing Maggie Smith's death, she was not only mourning a colleague, she was recognizing, once again, a kind of pain she already knew intimately. There is something worth noting about how differently these two women were perceived by the public despite living remarkably parallel lives. Dench, for much of her career, was cast in the public imagination as the warmer of the two, approachable, twinkly, quick to laugh in interviews. Smith was cast as the formidable one, the actress you would not want to disappoint. Those images were not entirely false, but they were incomplete, and in some ways they served as convenient shorthand that let audiences avoid grappling with the fuller complexity of either woman. Dench could be exacting and demanding in rehearsal, known among collaborators for having little patience for sloppy work. Smith, away from cameras, was reportedly capable of enormous generosity toward younger actors, offering guidance and encouragement to newcomers on sets who might have expected only intimidation. The public rarely got to see these inversions, because a simple narrative is easier to sell than a complicated one. That gap between public image and private reality may be part of why their friendship meant so much to each of them. Around most people, both women had to manage a version of themselves shaped by decades of public scrutiny. Around each other, that management was unnecessary. Neither one needed convincing of the other's talent, struggles, or contradictions, because both had already witnessed the evidence firsthand, over and over, for the better part of 70 years. The idea that Dench finally admitted the rumors about Maggie Smith is not about scandal. There was no feud, no falling out, no secret grudge. The rumor that persisted for years was simpler and, in some ways, more honest. That Dench and Smith were rivals. And the truth is that they were. In the way two towering figures in the same small field are almost always rivals. There are only so many roles written for commanding older actresses. There are only so many major honors to go around in a single generation. There are only so many greatest living actor conversations, and their names kept appearing in the same ones for over 50 years. They both knew this, and neither pretended otherwise. Smith could joke publicly that Dench always seemed to get asked first for interviews or honors, and the joke landed because there was a kernel of truth inside it. That is the kind of remark that only works between people who trust each other completely. From a stranger, it would sound resentful. From Smith, delivered with her particular dryness, it read as affection wearing a disguise. Their friendship survived because both women refused to let the industry's habit of pitting women against each other define how they saw one another. They did not pretend ambition was absent. They did not pretend that comparison never stung. They simply declined to let that sting curdle into hostility. In an industry that often prefers to write women as competitors locked in conflict, Dench and Smith offered something rare. Two people who could admit they were sizing each other up and still choose closeness over distance. They appeared together in the 2018 documentary Nothing Like a Dame, alongside fellow veteran actresses Eileen Atkins and Joan Plowright, sitting around a table trading stories about their careers with the ease of people who had nothing left to prove. They discussed aging, memory, and the strange indignities of a long life in public with a bluntness that felt almost startling. That documentary captured, better than almost anything else, what their relationship actually looked like. Not polished sentiment, but lived-in familiarity. Watching that footage now, after Smith's death, it plays differently. Moments that seemed simply funny at the time, the interruptions, the corrections, the good-natured jabs about whose career had gone in which direction, read now as evidence of exactly the closeness this piece is describing. None of the four women performed warmth for the cameras. They simply behaved the way people behave around others they no longer feel compelled to impress. For an audience used to seeing celebrated actresses either sparring dramatically or embracing sentimentally, that unguarded ordinariness was almost jarring. It also happened to be the truest thing any documentary crew had captured about either woman in years. It is also worth remembering that this kind of friendship, forged under professional pressure and sustained across an entire working life, is genuinely rare in an industry built on short-term collaboration. Most working relationships in film and theater exist for the length of a production and then dissolve, replaced by the next project and the next set of colleagues. Dench and Smith kept crossing paths across decades, from the Old Vic in the 1950s to A Room with a View in the 1980s, Tea with Mussolini in the 1990s, and the Marigold Hotel films in the 2010s. Each reunion added another layer to a relationship that had already survived enormous shifts in the industry, in their personal lives, and in the culture around them. Few friendships get tested by that much change and still hold their shape. In October 2024, roughly a week after Maggie Smith's death, Judi Dench appeared at the Cheltenham Literature Festival for a scheduled conversation. By most accounts, she arrived in reasonably good spirits, ready to talk, joke, and share stories, as she had done countless times before. Then interviewer Brendan O'Hare raised the subject of grief, referencing both Smith's death and that of another close friend and collaborator, actress Barbara Leigh Hunt, who had died around the same time. He asked Dench about a comparison she had made years earlier, describing grief as something like petrol, a source of energy rather than pure paralysis. Dench began to answer. She started to explain what she had meant by that comparison, referencing the grief she carried after losing her husband Michael Williams more than 2 decades earlier. And then, mid-sentence, she stopped. The composure that had carried her through nearly 7 decades of public performance simply gave out. She did not finish the thought. That moment mattered because of who Judi Dench is. She has spent her career mastering control, a voice of breath, of the tiny pause that can turn a line devastating. She has played queens, spies, and women who hold entire rooms silent through stillness alone. If anyone in British acting could have turned a question about grief into a composed, quotable answer, it would have been her. Instead, in front of an audience, she simply could not. The public had already mourned Maggie Smith as a towering cultural figure. Tributes poured in from co-stars, from younger actors she had shared scenes with in the Harry Potter franchise, from political leaders who acknowledged her decades of contribution to British culture. But Dench was not mourning the icon millions of strangers had watched on screen. She was mourning the woman she had known since 1957, when the two of them first crossed paths as young actresses at the Old Vic Theatre in London. She was mourning decades of private shorthand, inside jokes, shared dressing rooms, backstage complaints, and quiet understanding that no interview could ever fully capture. That is the kind of loss that does not respond to preparation. When someone who has known you since you were young dies, they take a version of you along with them, the version only they remembered. Maggie Smith remembered a Judi Dench the public never saw. Judi Dench remembered a Maggie Smith few people outside their closest circle ever glimpsed. When that connection ends, there is no polished way to summarize what has been lost. Dench's silence, in that unfinished sentence, said more than any tribute speech could have managed. In the months that followed, Dench found smaller, more private ways to process what she had lost. She has spoken about a long-standing habit of planting a tree at her home in Surrey to mark the memory of close friends who have died. A private forest that already included trees for collaborators like Alan Rickman and Diana Rigg. She later mentioned, in a television interview reflecting on Smith's life, that a tree planted in her memory had already produced fruit, and that she had carried one of the small apples with her to Smith's funeral. It is a quiet, almost unremarkable detail, the kind of thing that never makes it into an official tribute, but it captures something the Cheltenham moment only hinted at. Grief that continues privately long after the cameras and interviewers move on to other subjects. That contrast between the public unraveling on stage and the quiet, deliberate ritual of planting a tree says something important about how Dench processes loss. In front of an audience, she could not maintain the composure that decades of stagecraft usually gave her. Alone in her own garden, she found a way to hold onto Smith that needed no explanation to anyone else. Both responses, the public one and the private one, point to the same underlying truth. This was not a professional loss she could set aside once the interview ended. Part of what makes the Dench Smith story significant is how both women handled aging in an industry that rarely treats older women kindly. For much of film and television history, roles for women narrowed sharply after middle age. Smith and Dench both experienced that pressure directly across their careers, yet each found a way to make late career fame not a consolation prize, but a genuine reinvention. Smith's turn as Professor McGonagall introduced her to an entirely new generation of viewers, many of whom had no idea about her decades of stage work or her 2 Academy Awards. Her performance as the Dowager Countess in Downton Abbey did something similar, turning her into a global figure associated with cutting one-liners and aristocratic disdain. Both roles worked precisely because Smith brought decades of craft to characters that could easily have felt like caricature in less capable hands. She did not soften her age to be more palatable. She used it. Her authority on screen came directly from the accumulated weight of everything she had already done. Dench followed a similar path. Her portrayal of M in the James Bond franchise, beginning in 1995, reshaped the character from a background authority figure into a commanding presence whose approval and disapproval carried real weight. She was not decorative. She was the one figure in the franchise who could make even the most confident secret agent look like he answered to someone. Her age, rather than diminishing her presence, became part of what made her formidable. Together, without ever framing it as any kind of statement, Dench and Smith helped shift what older women could represent on screen. They were not sidelined into background roles once youth faded. They carried scenes, films, and franchises, proving that decades of experience could be a source of dramatic power rather than a limitation to work around. Their commercial success in later life also changed how studios and casting directors thought about older actresses more broadly. Before McGonagall and the Dowager Countess became global cultural touchstones, roles this prominent for women in their 60s, 70s, and 80s were far scarcer. Dench's M and Smith's late career franchise work did not just extend 2 individual careers. They demonstrated, in commercial terms an industry could not ignore, that audiences would show up in enormous numbers for stories built around older women with real authority. That shift opened space for other veteran actresses in the years that followed, even if neither Dench nor Smith ever framed their own work in those terms. They were simply doing what they had always done, taking the material seriously and trusting that craft, not youth, was what kept an audience watching. That makes the current chapter of Judi Dench's life especially poignant. In recent years, she has spoken openly about living with macular degeneration, a condition that has significantly affected her eyesight and made activities, like reading scripts, far more difficult. At 91, she is contending with the narrowing of the very tools that built her career: her ability to read, to recognize faces, to navigate a stage or set independently. Losing Maggie Smith arrived alongside this new and more personal kind of loss, one that touches her daily life rather than a single relationship. And yet, by all accounts, Dench has continued expressing a desire to keep working in whatever capacity remains possible to her. That stubborn commitment mirrors something Smith embodied as well. Neither woman treated acting as something to retire from gracefully once the body or eyes began to fail. For both of them, performance was never simply a job to leave behind. It was closer to a way of remaining themselves. So what did Judi Dench finally admit about Maggie Smith? Not a scandal, not a secret feud kept hidden for decades. What her unfinished sentence revealed was something more specific: that Maggie Smith was sharper than her public image suggested, but also far more vulnerable than her sharpest lines ever let on. She was competitive without being cruel. She was private without being empty. She could seem untouchable on screen, yet the people closest to her understood exactly how much she had endured off it. When a public figure dies, the world tends to compress them into their most memorable roles. Smith risks becoming, in collective memory, simply McGonagall, or the Dowager Countess, or the acid-tongued woman who could silence a room with a single glance. All of that is accurate, but none of it is complete. Dench's grief filled in part of what that compressed image leaves out. It reminded the public that Smith was not only a performer to admire from a distance. She was a friend whose absence reshaped rooms that no camera would ever enter. Seen this way, the old rumor of rivalry looks almost too small to matter. Of course, they measured themselves against each other. They spent more than half a century working in overlapping circles, competing for similar honors, sometimes standing in for the same kind of role. But the deeper truth their friendship revealed is that competition and closeness are not opposites. Many friendships survive by avoiding uncomfortable truths. Dench and Smith endured because they were willing to name those truths out loud and laugh at them before anyone else could use them as a weapon. That is the cruel, strange arithmetic of grief. It reframes irritation as affection. Teasing becomes proof of intimacy. Old jokes become evidence that someone once knew you well enough to needle you safely, and stood close enough to do it for decades. At 91, Judi Dench has little reason to maintain a polished public myth about her friendship with Maggie Smith. What she has shown instead, through an interview she could not finish rather than through carefully chosen words, is that Smith was never simply a colleague standing beside her in the history of British acting. She was one of the very few people who understood the full weight of a life they both chose to live: the applause, the pressure, the roles that got away, the losses that piled up quietly behind the public triumphs. In the end, Judi Dench and Maggie Smith were not two legends who happened to occupy the same era of British theater and film. They were two women who walked an unusually long road together, sometimes side by side, sometimes in quiet competition, sometimes simply laughing at the absurdity of still being asked, deep into their 80s, to explain a friendship that never needed explaining in the first place. When it came time to say goodbye, Judi Dench did not offer a flawless tribute. She offered silence and tears and an unfinished sentence. That may be the most honest admission of all. If this look at Judi Dench and Maggie Smith's decades-long friendship meant something to you, consider subscribing to the channel for more stories like this one, and leave a comment sharing which Maggie Smith role you will always remember first.